In music, modes are different patterns you can use to expand your songwriting palette, because each mode has a different feel, a different vibe that lends itself to different styles of melody and different chord progressions that can really make your music sound varied and interesting. And in my modes playlist, I explain how these different patterns are formed, how they're all really just permutations of the same pattern, of the major scale pattern. Here, we're going to look even further at modes to see how there's some special connections, some special symmetrical geometric connections that explain how they're all different and also related. Taking a step back first though, just thinking about modes, they can seem overwhelming when you first get into them because not only are there different types of modes, there's also two sets of modes, two different types, relative versus parallel. And combined, there are actually 13 different modes in a given key, which on the surface can seem like a lot, but really they're easy because they're all just permutations or variations of the same pattern, the major scale pattern, which we'll look at in detail here. And by looking at these patterns more closely, you can start to really make sense of the differences between these modes, but also how they're connected, because like I say, there's special symmetrical geometric connections between these patterns that inform how music is this intricate network of patterns, this intricate web of relationships that's beautiful. And once you see how it works, you can really wrap your head around modes and make use of them much more easily. Starting with relative modes in a table format like this, we have Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. So 7 different modes. And in this example, they're in the key of C, where they're all based on the C major scale. The Ionian mode is the C major scale itself. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. The Dorian mode just starts on the 2nd scale degree of the C major scale and ends on the 2nd scale degree. So D is the starting point and the end point. D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. The Phrygian mode in the key of C starts on E, the 3rd scale degree, and ends on E, and it sounds like this. It's all the same notes, but because we begin and end on a different note, this pattern has a different vibe, it has a different feel to it. And going down the line, each mode has its own feel. F Lydian, G Mixolydian, A Aeolian, and B Locrian. Looking at the same table, we can see if we replace the letters with numbers or the scale degrees, we can see if we make each respective scale degree the 1 of its own mode, then Ionian is the standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, or 8 of the major scale. Dorian, the intervals are 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, and 1. Phrygian is 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and 1, or 8, and so on down the line. If you think of each mode as a series of stepping stones, so in Ionian, for example, we skip from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There's a certain kind of rhythm or cadence as you jump from one stepping stone to the next. If you start on D, it's the same underlying pattern of whole steps and half steps, but because of where you begin, your feet kind of move in a different pattern and it creates a different kind of cadence or rhythm. In fact, if you think of these different modes as rhythms, you can see how each one has a different feel. In the Phrygian mode, for example, we start with the half step and move to a whole step that's a longer beat, a long beat, shorter beat, long beat, long beat. In the Lydian mode, it's a long beat, short beat, long beat, short beat, etc. The different patterns of beats in our metaphor, or interval spaces in pitch, result in different patterns, different modes that each have their own vibe. And looking at these modes in a table format like this gives us a good view of how they're all related, since they're just variations of the same pattern. But at first glance, it can also seem like a lot and even a little overwhelming. So to simplify things, here's a little trick that helps. And that is to reduce all of this down to cyclical pitch space, where the 12 basic notes of the chromatic scale form a loop like this. And from this pattern, we can then pick out the major scale, in our example C major, made from notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. As you saw before, this is just another name for C Ionian. And since each mode just begins and ends on each respective scale degree, we're already looking at all of the other relative modes as well, including D Dorian, E Phrygian, F Lydian, G Mixolydian, A Aeolian, and B Locrian. With each of them shown in pitch space like this, it's even easier to see how they're all just permutations of the very same pattern. So relative modes are really quite simple because they're just permutations or variations of the same underlying pattern. Parallel modes also work in a very similar way. They're all derived from the major scale pattern, but they kind of come about in a different way. Here's what I mean. If we look at the C parallel modes, the Ionian, C Ionian, is the same pattern as we saw before. It's C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And following the same idea of Dorian starting on the second scale degree of its source pattern, C Dorian is derived from B flat because a whole step back is B flat, and we have the second scale degree of B flat is C. So C Dorian comes from the B flat major scale. The Phrygian mode starts on scale degree 3 of its underlying scale. Going back 2 whole steps from C, we have A flat. So C Phrygian, C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, if we fill in these notes, B flat and C, is really just a permutation of the A flat major scale. And so on. Here's another look at that same basic pattern. So if we align all of these C notes, because they're parallel, C parallel modes, C Ionian is the C major scale of interval pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. C Dorian starts on the second scale degree of B flat, but saying that C is 1, the pattern becomes 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, and 8. C Phrygian is the third scale degree of its underlying pattern. So going back 2 whole steps, that's A flat. C Phrygian, the interval pattern is 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and 8. But it's just a permutation of the A flat major scale, and so on down the line. This table format shows how all of these parallel modes are formed. But again, using a circular format to clarify, C Ionian, of course, is just the C major scale. And then looking at C Dorian, since the Dorian mode begins on scale degree 2 of its source scale, this means that when we go back a whole step, this is the major scale that C Dorian comes from, which is B flat major. C Phrygian begins on the third degree of its source scale, so reverse engineering that out, we land on A flat. So the C Phrygian mode comes from the A flat major scale. C Lydian likewise comes from the G major scale. C Mixolydian is derived from F major. C Aeolian is from E flat major. And C Locrian is the 7th mode of D flat major. All of the different modes are just permutations or variations of an underlying major scale pattern. So then why is there a distinction between relative modes versus parallel modes? If they all come from a major scale pattern, what's the difference? There's a key difference, and a way to think of it is how the major scale pattern that forms the different modes is like the host of a party, and the different modes are guests at that party. And so depending on who the host is and who the guests are, that's the difference between relative and parallel modes. Let me show you what I mean. Looking at the key of C, for example, we have the C major scale, and the C major scale is what gives context to all of the different modes that are derived from it. C Ionian is just the C major scale itself. D Dorian is a permutation of that pattern. E Phrygian is a permutation of that same pattern, and so on. So in this case, C major is the host of the party. It gives context to every pattern, every guest at that party. All of these relative modes are just guests at this party. And in a circular formation, you can see that's the case down here. You have C Ionian, which starts on C, D Dorian begins on D, E Phrygian, F Lydian, G Mixolydian, A Aeolian, and B Locrian. Each one starts on a respective scale degree, but really all of them are just permutations or variations of the same underlying underlying pattern. The C major scale is the context for all of these modes. They're just guests at the same underlying party thrown by the host, C major in this case. In contrast, all of the C parallel modes are really permutations of other major scales. C Ionian is itself the C major scale. C Dorian comes from the B flat major scale. C Phrygian comes from the A flat major scale. C Lydian from G major. C Mixolydian from F major. C Aeolian from E flat major. And C Locrian from D flat major. But by aligning all of the C notes in this way, we say they're parallel because we're looking at things from the perspective of C. But in this case, C is just a guest from various parties, and the circular diagrams illustrate this as well. Each circle is a different major scale. In this case, we've aligned all of the ones at the top to say that they're parallel, but each pattern is from a different major scale. It's the same interval pattern of whole steps and half steps, but in the case of C Dorian, for example, C is a guest at B flat's party. In the case of C Phrygian, C is a guest at A flat's party. In the case of C Lydian, C is a guest at G's party, and so on. So hopefully this analogy of hosts and guests and different parties helps you kind of see the difference between relative and parallel modes. And so looking at these modes in summary, this explains why there's 13 different modes in a given key. So in the key of C, for example, we have up here all of the relative modes, and the second row is all of the parallel modes. C Ionian is in both, but then all of the relative modes are permutations of C major, because C major is the host of all of these parties. And then all of the parallel C parallel modes show that C was a guest at a variety of parties where each respective major scale was its own host, and C was a guest in each one. But to further solidify your understanding of the similarities between modes and the differences between relative and parallel modes, I mentioned earlier that there's this geometric symmetry that informs how these different modes are connected. Relative versus parallel. So to show that even more, if you look again in the key of C at these C relative modes, notice how they all slant down to the right, with C Ionian at the top and B Locrian at the bottom. And looking again at all of the C parallel modes, these modes slant down to the left. And when we overlay these patterns, you can see that there's a perfect symmetry between the relative and parallel modes in a given key. The C relative modes are like a reflection of the C parallel modes. And this isn't just a pretty diagram, it goes deeper than that. Looking at the Ionian modes, for example, C Ionian is the same in both the relative modes group and the parallel modes group. This pattern begins and ends on C. C is on either end. The Dorian mode in the C relative group begins and ends on D. So over here we have D, and then in the parallel group, the Dorian mode, C Dorian, is derived from B flat. So we have B flat over here. And these two notes, D and B flat, are symmetrical around C because they're both spaced at a whole step interval on either side of C. Looking at the Phrygian patterns, the Phrygian mode in the relative modes group begins and ends on E, while in the parallel modes group, C Phrygian is derived from A flat. And these two notes, E and A flat, are also symmetrical around C. They're both spaced at 2 whole steps on either side of C. In the relative modes group, C relative modes, the Lydian mode begins and ends on F, while in the parallel modes group, C Lydian is derived from the G major scale. So F and G likewise are symmetrical around C. And continuing on, F and G share similar relationships in the Mixolydian mode, E flat and A in the Aeolian mode, and D flat and B in the Locrian mode. Looking at this in yet another way, if we take all of the C parallel modes and arrange them into a circle of fifths formation, we can see how all of the keys from which the C parallel modes are derived are neighbors in the circle of fifths. All of the hosts that threw the parties in which the C parallel modes appear are all next to each other in this pattern. Now the circle of fifths pattern just shows how all of the keys in music overlap, forming a daisy chain sequence where each major scale is made up of equal parts of the keys on either side, which I explain in another video. But focusing here on all of the keys that share a connection through the C parallel modes, we can see in this circle that the C note shows up multiple times in these different locations. In the key of G, this C note is the 4th scale degree. And when you begin a parallel mode on the 4th scale degree, you get the Lydian pattern. C Ionian begins on C. C Mixolydian begins on the 5th scale degree of the F major pattern. So C is the 5th scale degree of F major, so we have Mixolydian here. And then moving into counterclockwise, we have C Dorian coming from the key of B flat major. C Aeolian begins on the 6th scale degree of E flat major. C Phrygian begins on the 3rd scale degree of A flat major, and C Locrian begins on the 7th scale degree, which shows up right here in the key of D flat major. So all 7 of the C parallel modes move in a counterclockwise direction in the circle of fifths. And then all of the C relative modes technically are just permutations of the C major scale, so they're found here in the circle of fifths, but the tonics of each relative mode progress in a clockwise direction in this pattern. C major is the Ionian mode, D is the 2nd scale degree of the C major scale, E is the 3rd scale degree, etc. All of the relative modes in the key of C progress in a clockwise direction. So again, counterclockwise we have all of the parallel modes, and clockwise we have all of the relative modes. Ionian, in the case of C, is centered around C. The Mixolydian and Lydian modes are mirror images. Dorian, Aeolian, Phrygian, and Locrian are also symmetrical within the circle of fifths. Not only within a single key like the key of C, but the symmetry appears in all 12 keys. So all of these different modes, relative modes and parallel modes, are similar but also different. They're similar because they're all permutations or variations of the major scale pattern, but they're different in how you arrive at them. Using the host versus guest metaphor hopefully helps, but then also seeing how they're symmetrical geometric connections that inform how these patterns are formed and relate helps make it more concrete, so it doesn't feel arbitrary or, man, there's a lot of modes to wrap my head around. There are, but there's a method to the madness. There's an order to the logic. Music theory is inherently cyclical, symmetrical, and there's an underlying geometric nature to all these things. So hopefully this was helpful, and if so, please let the algorithm know. Actually, I forgot to say that there's a PDF with all of these diagrams in the community. There's a link in the video notes, so definitely check that out. And I will see you in the next video.